It was just another busy morning at Los Angeles International Airport, where the sun had barely risen above the horizon, casting long shadows across the terminal's gleaming floors. Among the crowd of early travelers stood a man in his mid-30s, dressed in casual clothes, a simple blue sweater and black slacks. He could have been any other passenger, but he was actually one of the airline's most experienced pilots. The airport cafe was packed with the usual morning rush of caffeine-seeking travelers. The pilot waited patiently in line, scrolling through weather reports on his phone, mentally preparing for the cross-country flight ahead. He had flown this route countless times, but every flight was unique, and he took his pre-flight routine seriously. A few spots ahead of him in line, a group of 5 well-dressed passengers were making quite a scene. They appeared to be friends heading to New York for what sounded like a business conference. Their loud laughter and inside jokes caught everyone's attention, but not in a good way. "Can you believe they let just anyone fly these days?" One of them snickered, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "I saw this guy in the cockpit last week who barely looked old enough to drive." The pilot kept his eyes on his phone, but his ears couldn't help picking up their conversation. 20 years of flying had taught him that passengers often spoke without thinking, especially when travel stress kicked in. He'd learned to let comments roll off his back, focusing instead on what really mattered, getting everyone safely to their destination. The group's conversation took an uglier turn when they noticed him. "Hey, look at this guy," one of them whispered, not quite quietly enough. "Bet he's one of those 1AB executives. Probably got his clothes from a discount store." Another chimed in with a poor imitation of an Asian accent, making assumptions based on the pilot's appearance. The cafe grew uncomfortably quiet as other passengers shifted awkwardly, some shooting sympathetic glances his way. The pilot took a deep breath, maintaining his composure. He'd faced similar situations before, but it never got easier. Still, he knew his worth wasn't determined by random strangers' opinions. He had over 15,000 flight hours under his belt and had handled everything from mechanical emergencies to medical crises mid-flight. The barista behind the counter, who had witnessed the whole scene, gave him an apologetic smile as he ordered his regular black coffee. "Don't mind them," she said softly, having served him many times before. "Some people just don't know any better." He smiled back warmly. "No worries. I've seen all types come through here." As he waited for his coffee, he overheard more of the group's conversation. They were booked on the 8:30 a.m. flight to JFK, his flight. He couldn't help but notice the irony of the situation, knowing they'd soon be trusting their lives to someone they just mocked. Walking toward his gate, coffee in hand, the pilot reflected on how appearances could be deceiving. These passengers had no idea that the man they'd just ridiculed would be responsible for safely flying them across the country. He wasn't angry. If anything, he felt a twinge of sadness at their narrow-mindedness. In the crew room, he changed into his uniform, straightening his captain's stripes with practiced precision. His co-pilot was already there, going through the pre-flight checklist. They discussed the weather conditions expected along their route, clear skies until they hit the Midwest, where some turbulence was predicted. "Ready for another day in the office?" his co-pilot asked, noting his quieter-than-usual demeanor. "Always," he replied with a genuine smile. "Just had an interesting morning coffee run." As they walked through the terminal toward their aircraft, the pilot spotted the group from the cafe, now lunging at the gate. They didn't recognize him in his uniform, their earlier mockery forgotten as they scrolled through their phones and laptops. During the pre-flight inspection, walking around the massive aircraft that would soon carry 238 souls across the country, the pilot reminded himself why he loved his job. It wasn't about proving anything to anyone, it was about the joy of flying and the responsibility of keeping people safe. The morning light glinted off the aircraft's polished surface as he completed his walk-around. Every detail mattered. The control surfaces, the engines, the landing gear. While some passengers might see pilots as glorified bus drivers, he knew the truth. Flying was a complex dance of physics, meteorology, and split-second decision-making. Back in the cockpit, he began the startup sequence, his hands moving confidently across the controls. Through the cockpit window, he watched as passengers began boarding, including the group from the cafe. They were still laughing among themselves, completely unaware that their safety would soon be in the hands of the very person they'd ridiculed. The flight attendant closed the cockpit door, and he took a moment to center himself. Personal feelings had no place in the cockpit. His focus needed to be entirely on the flight ahead. As he picked up the microphone for his welcome announcement, he couldn't help but wonder how those passengers would react when they heard his voice. Little did anyone know that this routine morning would soon turn into something none of them would ever forget. Sometimes life has a way of teaching unexpected lessons, and today's flight would prove to be one of those moments. The first signs of what was to come were still hours away as the massive aircraft pushed back from the gate, its engines humming to life. For now, it was just another flight departing LAX, carrying its passengers toward their destination, and toward an experience that would change their perspectives forever. 2 hours into the flight, the massive aircraft cruised smoothly at 36,000 feet above America's heartland. The morning sun streamed through the windows, and most passengers had settled into their usual flight routines, some sleeping, others watching movies, and a few working on laptops. That's when the first unexpected bump jolted the cabin. It wasn't anything serious, just the kind of turbulence experienced pilots deal with daily. The pilot had noticed the weather system developing on his radar and had already switched on the seatbelt sign as a precaution. The group from the cafe, seated in the middle section of the plane, seemed particularly affected by the slight disturbance. What kind of pilot can't avoid a little rough air? One of them complained loudly, gripping his armrests. His friends joined in, their earlier arrogance resurfacing despite their obvious discomfort. A flight attendant passing by with the beverage cart paused to address their concerns. "The captain has turned on the seatbelt sign due to some expected turbulence," she explained professionally. "It's perfectly normal for this route, especially during this time of year." But the group wasn't satisfied. "Normal? I fly this route every month, and it's never this bumpy," another one chimed in, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "They must have some rookie in the cockpit today." An elderly gentleman across the aisle couldn't help but intervene. "Young man," he said calmly, "I've been flying for 40 years, and this is nothing to worry about. The pilots know what they're doing." The plane encountered another patch of rougher air, causing the drinks in plastic cups to slosh. A few passengers gasped, and a child somewhere in the back started crying. The group's complaints grew louder. Their previous mockery of the pilot in the cafe now evolved into outright criticism of the entire flight crew. In the cockpit, the pilot remained focused on his instruments, monitoring the weather patterns while his co-pilot communicated with air traffic control. They'd spotted a larger storm system developing ahead and were already planning a slight course adjustment to provide a smoother ride. Back in the cabin, the turbulence had triggered a wave of anxiety among some passengers. A young mother tried to comfort her frightened toddler, while business travelers attempted to type on their laptops despite the occasional bumps. Through it all, the group from the cafe continued their running commentary, their voices carrying across several rows. "I'm filing a complaint when we land," one announced, his face slightly pale despite his bravado. "This is completely unprofessional. They should have warned us about this before takeoff." A flight attendant made another pass through the cabin, checking seatbelts and offering reassurance to nervous passengers. When she reached the group, she maintained her professional demeanor despite their increasingly hostile attitudes. "I demand to speak to the captain," one of them insisted. "We need someone experienced up there, not whatever amateur is flying this plane." The flight attendant smiled patiently. "Sir, I assure you our captain has thousands of hours of flight experience. This turbulence is perfectly normal, and we're already adjusting our route to avoid the worst of it." The irony of the situation wasn't lost on the flight attendant who had witnessed the earlier scene in the airport cafe. She knew exactly who was flying the plane and the expertise he brought to the cockpit. But professional ethics prevented her from saying anything about it. As the minutes ticked by, the turbulence gradually increased. Overhead bins rattled, and the airplane's wings could be seen flexing slightly, a normal feature of aircraft design, but unsettling to those who didn't understand aviation engineering. The group's complaints had now attracted the attention of most nearby passengers. Some rolled their eyes at their behavior, while others seemed to be getting increasingly anxious because of their dramatic reactions. An off-duty pilot seated a few rows behind them finally spoke up. "Folks, what you're experiencing is completely normal turbulence. Aircraft are designed to handle much worse. The flexing of the wings you're seeing? That's actually a safety feature." But the group was too caught up in their own drama to listen to reason. They continued their running commentary about the pilot's supposed incompetence, completely unaware that the same person they'd mocked earlier was currently working to ensure their comfort and safety. In the cockpit, the pilots watched their weather radar showing more severe weather developing ahead. They knew the next hour would be challenging, but they had already begun coordinating with air traffic control to find the smoothest possible route through the weather system. The co-pilot glanced at his colleague, noticing his focused but calm demeanor despite the difficulties ahead and the commotion they could hear from the cabin. "Sounds like we've got some unhappy customers back there," he commented. The pilot simply nodded, his attention fixed on the task at hand. Years of experience had taught him that maintaining professional focus was crucial, especially when things got challenging. What mattered wasn't the opinions of a few uncomfortable passengers, but the safety of everyone on board. Little did anyone know that the turbulence was just the beginning of their troubles. As the aircraft continued its journey eastward, more serious challenges were brewing. Challenges that would soon make everyone forget about a few bumpy minutes in the sky. The next hour would test not only the pilot's flying skills, but also his ability to remain professional in the face of prejudice and criticism. As the weather ahead grew more threatening, the true measure of his experience and capability would soon become clear to everyone on board, including those who had judged him so quickly at the airport cafe. The first sign that something was seriously wrong came with a subtle vibration that felt different from the earlier turbulence. The pilot noticed it immediately, a slight tremor in the controls that shouldn't have been there. His trained ears picked up a change in the sound of the right engine, a discordant note in the usually steady hum. In the passenger cabin, most people were too preoccupied with the continuing turbulence to notice anything unusual. The group from the cafe had finally quieted down somewhat, though they still muttered complaints to each other. A flight attendant was making her way down the aisle, checking on passengers, when she felt the change in the aircraft's movement. The pilot was running through his mental checklist when his co-pilot suddenly grabbed his chest and slumped forward. "I don't feel," he managed to say before his voice trailed off. His face had gone pale, and sweat beaded on his forehead. Without hesitation, the pilot hit the call button for the senior flight attendant. Years of emergency training kicked in as he simultaneously monitored the increasingly troublesome engine and kept an eye on his now unconscious colleague. The senior flight attendant entered the cockpit and immediately assessed the situation. "Medical emergency," the pilot said calmly, though his mind was racing. "Get him out of here and find out if there's a doctor on board. I'll need you to send someone up to help me with communications." As the flight attendant called for assistance, the right engine's vibration grew worse. Warning lights began to flash on the instrument panel, their urgent glow reflecting off the cockpit windows. The pilot knew he was now facing a dual crisis, a serious mechanical issue, and an incapacitated co-pilot. The co-pilot was carefully moved from the cockpit, and another flight attendant took his place to handle radio communications. The pilot remained focused, his hands steady on the controls as he dealt with the deteriorating situation. In the cabin, passengers watched with growing concern as flight attendants hurried back and forth. The unconscious co-pilot was laid across a row of seats, where two doctors who had been on board immediately began attending to him. The group from the cafe had front-row seats to the unfolding drama. Their earlier bravado had evaporated, replaced by nervous whispers. "What's going on?" One of them asked a passing flight attendant, but she was too busy to respond. Back in the cockpit, multiple warning systems were now demanding attention. The right engine's problems were worsening, and the weather ahead looked increasingly threatening. The pilot knew he needed to make some crucial decisions quickly. He picked up the intercom microphone, knowing his voice would be recognized by the group that had mocked him earlier. But that was the least of his concerns now. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking," he began, his voice calm and professional. "We are currently dealing with some technical issues, and our co-pilot has had a medical emergency. We have two doctors on board attending to him. I want to assure you that I am fully qualified to fly this aircraft alone, and your safety is my top priority." The cabin fell silent as his words sank in. The group from the cafe exchanged shocked glances as they recognized the voice. The same person they had ridiculed just hours ago was now their only hope for safety. The engine's vibration had become a violent shuddering that everyone could feel. The pilot worked quickly, shutting down the troubled engine according to emergency procedures while communicating with air traffic control about possible emergency landing sites. Through the cockpit door, he could hear the mixture of scared murmurs and prayers from the passengers. The weather radar showed a massive storm system ahead, one they would have to skirt around with only one engine, making their situation even more precarious. The flight attendant beside him relayed messages from air traffic control as he calculated fuel consumption, weather patterns, and potential landing sites. With one engine down, they couldn't maintain their current altitude for long. Every decision he made now would be crucial. A violent shudder ran through the aircraft as they began to descend. The pilot handled the controls with the expertise that came from thousands of hours in the cockpit, compensating for the dead engine while managing their gradual descent through turbulent air. In the cabin, the doctors continued to work on the co-pilot, who had started to show signs of improvement but remained unconscious. The flight attendants moved efficiently through the cabin, securing loose items and reassuring frightened passengers. The group from the cafe sat in stunned silence, their earlier mockery forgotten as they felt the aircraft shudder around them. One of them was quietly crying, while another gripped his armrests so hard his knuckles had turned white. Through it all, the pilot's voice remained steady on the intercom, providing updates and reassurance. He didn't mention the increasingly difficult conditions or the complications of flying through weather with one engine. His focus was entirely on keeping his passengers calm and getting them safely on the ground. As they continued their descent, the reality of their situation became clearer to everyone on board. Their lives were in the hands of the very person some of them had judged so harshly just hours before. The irony wasn't lost on anyone, least of all the group from the cafe, who now sat in humbled silence. The storm clouds ahead loomed dark and threatening, and the single working engine labored as they pushed through areas of turbulence. But in the cockpit, the pilot remained focused and determined. He had trained for situations like this, had run through similar scenarios in simulators countless times. Now, with 238 lives depending on him, he would put every bit of his experience to use. The next few minutes would test his skills to their absolute limit as he faced the challenge of navigating through severe weather with a crippled aircraft. The real crisis was just beginning, and everyone on board was about to learn a powerful lesson about prejudice, professionalism, and grace under pressure. The revelation hit the cabin like a wave when the pilot's voice came over the intercom again. Among all the passengers, none were more affected than the group from the cafe, who sat frozen in their seats as they recognized the same voice they had mocked just hours earlier. "This is your captain again," his steady voice announced. "We're continuing our descent and working with air traffic control to find the safest route around the storm system. I want you to know that while we're having some challenges, this aircraft is designed to fly safely on one engine, and I'm trained specifically for situations like this." One of the group members buried his face in his hands, remembering his crude imitation of an Asian accent at the cafe. Another one had turned ghostly pale, recalling his loud comments about incompetent pilots. The weight of their earlier behavior pressed down on them harder than the turbulence shaking the plane. In the cockpit, the pilot remained focused on his instruments, working with the flight attendant who was helping with communications. Warning lights still flashed, demanding attention, but his movements were precise and calculated. Years of training had prepared him for this moment. A flight attendant who had witnessed the cafe incident passed by the now quiet group. One of them caught her sleeve. "The pilot," he said quietly, "it's the same man from the coffee shop, isn't it?" She gave a simple nod and continued her duties, leaving them to process their shame. The aircraft shuddered again as they passed through another patch of rough air. This time, none of the group complained. Instead, they listened intently to every announcement, holding on to each word from the man they had judged so harshly. Through the windows, passengers could see the dead engine, a sight that would normally cause panic. But the captain's calm, professional voice had a steadying effect on everyone. He explained each major movement of the aircraft, each change in direction, helping passengers understand what was happening. "The judgments we made," one of the group whispered to his colleagues, "we never even considered." His voice trailed off as the plane banked left, avoiding a particularly dark storm cloud. In the rear of the plane, the two doctors continued monitoring the co-pilot, who had been stabilized but remained unable to return to duty. One of them sent a message to the captain through a flight attendant, updating him on his colleague's condition. The pilot acknowledged the message while simultaneously managing communications with air traffic control and adjusting their flight path. His multitasking abilities, honed over decades in the cockpit, were being put to the ultimate test. A young passenger, no more than 7 years old, asked his mother loudly enough for nearby passengers to hear, "Mom, is the pilot the same man those mean people were laughing at?" The question cut through the cabin like a knife, causing several passengers to turn and stare at the group. The shame on their faces was evident. One of them was quietly wiping tears from his eyes, not from fear, but from the crushing realization of how wrong they had been. Their expensive suits and arrogant attitudes seemed meaningless now as they faced the consequences of their prejudice. Another announcement came. "We're coordinating with air traffic control to divert to a nearby airport. The weather ahead of us is too severe to attempt reaching New York with one engine. I assure you this is purely a precautionary measure." The same voice they had mocked for its slight accent now brought comfort to everyone on board. Each word was clear, professional, and reassuring. The pilot's expertise was evident in how he handled both the aircraft and the passengers' concerns. Through the cloud breaks, the ground became visible far below. The single working engine hummed steadily, keeping them aloft as they navigated through patches of turbulence. The pilot's skill was evident in how smoothly he managed the compromised aircraft. One of the group members turned to the others. "We need to apologize to him," he said quietly. "After we land, if we land." The others nodded in agreement, their earlier arrogance completely dissolved. A flight attendant who had overheard them added softly, "He's one of our most experienced pilots. 20 years of flying, including military service. He's handled situations far worse than this." She moved on, leaving them to reflect on their prejudgments. The aircraft descended through a layer of clouds, emerging into clearer air. The pilot's voice came again, explaining their approach strategy and what passengers should expect. Even in crisis, he maintained his professionalism, never letting on about the complexity of flying a crippled aircraft. In the cockpit, he worked steadily, his movements precise and deliberate. The flight attendant helping with communications watched in amazement as he handled multiple challenges simultaneously, never losing his composure. The group from the cafe sat silently, hanging on every word from the cockpit. Their phones lay forgotten in their pockets. Their earlier complaints about flight schedules and business meetings now seemed trivially unimportant. As the reality of their situation continued to unfold, everyone on board was learning a powerful lesson about prejudice and professionalism. The man they had judged solely on his appearance was now the one person standing between them and disaster. The next phase would be critical as they approached their emergency landing, but the pilot's unwavering professionalism had already taught everyone on board a lesson they would never forget. Sometimes the most powerful teaching moments come not from words, but from actions, and his actions spoke volumes about character, competence, and grace under pressure. Fighting against time became more critical with each passing minute. Dark storm clouds loomed ahead like massive walls, while the crippled aircraft pushed forward on its single working engine. In the cockpit, the pilot's hands moved steadily across the controls, his eyes constantly scanning the instruments while calculating their remaining fuel. "Center, this is Flight 2317, he spoke into his radio, his voice remaining professional despite the stress. "Request immediate vectors around this weather system. We're showing red returns on our radar at our 12 o'clock position." The response from air traffic control crackled through. "Flight 2317, weather is intensive for the next 100 miles along your route. Suggest deviation of 30 degrees to the right for weather avoidance." Inside the cabin, the tension was palpable. Flight attendants moved efficiently through the aisles, securing loose items and checking seatbelts. The weather outside the windows had turned menacing, with dark clouds surrounding them on all sides. Through it all, the single engine continued its steady drone, though every passenger was now acutely aware that they were flying with only half their normal power. The aircraft occasionally shuddered as it pushed through patches of turbulence, each bump causing nervous glances among the passengers. The group from the cafe sat quietly, their earlier arrogance completely evaporated. They watched through their windows as lightning occasionally illuminated the clouds around them. One of them clutched a small photo of his family, while another seemed lost in prayer. The pilot's voice came over the intercom again. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're working to find the smoothest route around this weather system. Our current track will take us slightly south of our planned route. I want to assure you that despite our engine situation, we have plenty of fuel to reach a safe landing site." A child began crying somewhere in the back of the plane, and nearby passengers tried to comfort both the child and the worried mother. The sound seemed to emphasize the gravity of their situation. Hundreds of lives, including young families, depending on the skill of the pilot they had mocked just hours before. In the cockpit, the pilot was engaged in a complex dance of monitoring systems, communicating with air traffic control. The turbulence increased as they skirted the edge of a storm cell. The pilot's hands moved steadily on the controls, compensating for each bump and gust. Through the cockpit window, lightning illuminated the clouds in brilliant flashes, creating an otherworldly scene. One of the flight attendants passed through the cabin with an update. The captain asks that everyone remain in their seats with seat belts fastened. "We're working to find smoother air, but it may take some time." The irony of the situation wasn't lost on anyone. The very pilot who had been the target of prejudice and mockery was now the only thing standing between them and disaster. His skill and professionalism were on display with every smooth correction, every careful navigation decision. Time seemed to slow down as they pushed through the weather. Each minute brought new challenges, shifting winds, deteriorating conditions, and the constant strain on the single working engine. The pilot remained focused, his years of experience evident in every decision. Through breaks in the clouds, passengers could occasionally see the ground far below, a reminder of just how high they were and how much depended on getting this right. The pilot worked tirelessly, coordinating with air traffic control to find the safest possible route through the weather. The aircraft's wing flexed visibly during stronger gusts, a normal feature of aircraft design that nonetheless caused concern among passengers unfamiliar with aviation. The pilot's periodic updates helped calm these fears, his steady voice explaining what was normal and what to expect. As they continued their careful navigation through the storm system, the true measure of professional skill was on display. This wasn't just about flying an airplane, it was about managing a crisis while maintaining the confidence of hundreds of scared passengers. The next phase would be crucial as they approached their decision point for landing. Fuel was becoming a more pressing concern, and the weather wasn't improving. But in the cockpit, the pilot remained focused and determined, his hands steady on the controls as he guided them through the storm. No one in the cabin could see his face, but his voice continued to project calm and confidence. The same voice they had mocked earlier now brought reassurance to everyone on board, proving that character and competence run far deeper than appearance or accent. The storm clouds ahead still looked threatening, but the pilot's unwavering professionalism gave everyone hope. As they pushed forward into the darkening sky, the next few minutes would test not just his flying skills, but his ability to make the critical decisions that would determine everyone's fate. The critical moment arrived as warning lights on the fuel panel began to flash. The pilot knew he had to make a decision that would affect the lives of everyone on board. The nearest major airport was still over an hour away, but there was a smaller regional airport in Pennsylvania that they could reach in 20 minutes. "Philadelphia Center, this is Flight 2317, he radioed, his voice steady despite the pressure. "Requesting immediate clearance to Lehigh Valley International. We need to get this aircraft on the ground soon." The response came quickly. "Flight 2317, cleared to Lehigh Valley. Be advised runway conditions are wet and winds are gusting to 30 knots. In the cabin, passengers could feel the aircraft banking as it changed course. The storm continued to rage outside, lightning illuminating the clouds in brilliant flashes. The single engine labored against the elements, its sound now familiar to everyone on board. The pilot's voice came over the intercom again. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're diverting to Lehigh Valley International Airport. The weather there is challenging, but the runway is long enough for our aircraft, and we have emergency services standing by. I need everyone to pay close attention to the flight attendant's instructions." The flight attendants began moving through the cabin, demonstrating the brace position and reviewing emergency procedures. Their professional calm helped keep passengers focused and prevented panic from spreading. In the cockpit, the pilot was performing complex calculations in his head. The wet runway would affect their stopping distance. The gusty crosswind would make the landing more challenging. And with only one engine, they would have just one chance to get it right. One of the group members from the cafe turned to his colleagues, his voice barely a whisper. "How could we have been so wrong about him? He's saving all our lives." The aircraft descended through layers of clouds, each one bringing new turbulence. The pilot handled each bump expertly, compensating for the dead engine while maintaining their approach path. His movements were precise, each adjustment calculated and purposeful. Rain began pelting the windows as they broke through the cloud base. The airport was visible in the distance, its runway lights piercing through the gloom. But the crosswind was pushing hard against the aircraft's side, making the approach even more challenging. "Cabin crew, secure for landing," the pilot announced. His voice remained calm, but everyone could sense the gravity of the situation. They were committed now. There would be no second chances. The flight attendants made their final cabin check, ensuring everyone's seatbelt was fastened tight. They paid special attention to the young families, helping parents secure their children and explaining what to expect. Through the cockpit window, the runway appeared and disappeared as sheets of rain swept across their path. The single-engine sound filled the cabin as the pilot carefully managed their descent rate. Every pilot training scenario, every simulator session, every lesson learned over 20 years of flying would be put to the test in the next few minutes. The group from the cafe sat in complete silence, their hands gripping their armrests. One of them was quietly crying, not from fear, but from shame at their earlier behavior. They watched through their windows as the ground grew closer, each of them silently praying for the skill of the pilot they had so carelessly judged. 500 feet, called out the flight computer's automated voice. The pilot's hands were steady on the controls, making constant small adjustments for the gusting wind. The runway lights grew larger in the windscreen, their glow diffused by the heavy rain. A strong gust hit the aircraft from the side, causing it to drift. The pilot responded instantly, correcting their path with practiced precision. The single engine roared as he adjusted the power, keeping them on the correct glide path. 300 feet came the next call out. The tension in the cabin was palpable. Parents held their children close, couples clasped hands, and more than a few passengers closed their eyes in prayer. The rain intensified, creating sheets of water across the windscreen. The pilot focused intently on his instruments, trusting his training and experience more than what his eyes could see through the storm. 100 feet, the computer announced. The runway threshold passed beneath them as the pilot began the flare maneuver, carefully adjusting their descent rate for touchdown. The whole aircraft seemed to hold its breath in that final moment. The pilot's decades of experience, his countless hours of training, and his unwavering professionalism had brought them to this crucial point. Time seemed to slow down as they approached the runway. The crosswind continued to buffet the aircraft, but the pilot's hands remained steady on the controls. Every movement was deliberate, every adjustment precise. In these final moments before touchdown, no one was thinking about accents, appearances, or prejudices. All that mattered was the skill and dedication of the person in the cockpit, the same person who had faced mockery just hours before. The next few seconds would determine everything. The pilot focused intensely, knowing that landing a crippled aircraft in these conditions would require every bit of skill he possessed. The lives of everyone on board depended on what would happen in the next crucial moments. The aircraft touched down with remarkable precision, despite the driving rain and gusting winds. The pilot's hands moved smoothly over the controls, managing the thrust reverser on the single working engine while applying careful brake pressure on the wet runway. The massive aircraft slowed steadily, water spraying from its wheels as it decelerated. When they finally came to a complete stop, the cabin remained silent for a moment before erupting in spontaneous applause. Relief and gratitude washed over the passengers' faces as they realized they were safely on the ground. Many were crying, others hugging complete strangers seated next to them. Emergency vehicles surrounded the aircraft, their lights flashing through the rain. A standard procedure for emergency landings. The pilot's voice came over the intercom one final time. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Lehigh Valley International Airport. Please remain in your seats until we reach our parking position." The group from the cafe sat quietly, their faces showing a mixture of relief and shame. They watched through their windows as ground crew members inspected the dead engine, the reality of what they'd just survived slowly sinking in. As passengers began to deplane, many stopped to thank the flight attendants who had maintained their professionalism throughout the crisis. The two doctors who had attended to the co-pilot reported that he was stable and had been transferred to a waiting ambulance. The pilot remained in the cockpit, completing his final checks and filling out necessary documentation. He could hear the passengers filing past the cockpit door, but his focus was on his professional duties, just as it had been throughout the flight. The group from the cafe waited until most other passengers had deplaned. They stood nervously near the cockpit door, knowing they needed to face the man they had wronged. When the pilot finally emerged, they barely recognized him as the same person they had mocked in the airport cafe. His presence now commanded a respect they had been too prejudiced to see before. One of them stepped forward, his voice shaking. "Captain, we were the ones at the cafe this morning. We can't begin to tell you how sorry we are." The pilot looked at them calmly, his face showing no anger or resentment. "The important thing is that everyone is safe," he replied simply. Another member of the group spoke up, tears in his eyes. "You saved our lives after we treated you so badly. We judged you without knowing anything about you. We were completely wrong." The pilot's response was measured and dignified. "We all learn and grow from our experiences. Today taught us all something important." His words carried no hint of superiority or vindication, just quiet wisdom. A young flight attendant who had witnessed both the cafe incident and the emergency landing watched this exchange with tears in her eyes. The contrast between the morning's cruelty and the current moment of humility was powerful. Outside, the rain had begun to ease, and rays of sunlight broke through the clouds. Ground crew members continued their inspection of the aircraft, while passengers in the terminal pressed against windows to see the plane that had made such a remarkable landing. One of the group members pulled out a business card. "We know we can never make up for how we acted, but please, if there's ever anything you need." The pilot politely declined the card. "Just remember this feeling the next time you're tempted to judge someone based on their appearance. That's all I ask." As they walked away, visibly moved by his graciousness, other passengers approached to shake his hand and thank him. Parents brought their children to meet him, and several people asked to take photos with him. Through it all, the pilot maintained his humble demeanor. He deflected praise by mentioning the professionalism of his crew and the calmness of the passengers. His focus remained on others, never on himself. Later that evening, as the pilot prepared to leave the airport, he passed the same cafe where the morning's events had begun. The barista who had witnessed the earlier scene smiled and handed him a fresh coffee. "On the house, Captain. We saw the news about what happened." He accepted the coffee with a quiet thank you, then headed toward the exit. As he walked through the terminal, several passengers from other flights nodded respectfully, having heard about the emergency landing. The story had already spread throughout the airport. The group from the cafe had checked into an airport hotel, their business meetings in New York forgotten. That evening, they sat in the hotel restaurant, still processing the day's events. Their conversation was subdued, focused on how quickly they had judged someone based on superficial factors and how deeply wrong they had been. The pilot drove home that evening, the events of the day settling in his mind. He didn't dwell on the morning's insults or the afternoon's praise. Instead, he thought about the next day's flight, the upcoming training session he would lead, and the continuous responsibility of keeping passengers safe. As news of the incident spread, it became a powerful reminder that character, skill, and professionalism run far deeper than appearance or accent. The story would be retold many times, not just as an example of exceptional flying skill, but as a lesson about prejudice, professionalism, and the quiet dignity of someone who chose to rise above intolerance. The pilot's actions that day did more than save 238 lives. They taught a lasting lesson about judging others. Sometimes the most powerful teachings come not from words, but from actions, and his actions spoke volumes about character, competence, and grace under pressure. Ritchie.